history and culture. This flow is rooted in what people think, and what they think will determine how they act.
There is violence and a breakdown in society up to the point in which it's unsafe to walk through the streets in many of the cities of the world. On the other hand, there is a danger of increasing authoritarianism to meet the threat of chaos in our own countries and internationally. Should we despair and give in? If not, how should we then live? The answer as to whether we should throw up our hands and give in is no. There are good and sufficient reasons for this. We can receive help from a quarter, which would be unexpected to most modern men.
Obviously, the biggest question of all for human beings is evil. And the three families of faiths have a very, very different answer to evil. The East, Hinduism, Buddhism, is very, very realistic about evil. I would compliment Buddhism for being a kind of religion-sized answer to suffering and affliction and evil, what the Hindus call dukkha, affliction. But the trouble in the East, there is no solution for evil, suffering, injustice, and oppression in the world that we know it. The only answer is renounce the world, detach yourself from the world. In other words, in the Eastern view, what fuels everything is desire, which leads to craving, which leads to attachment, which binds us to the wheel. And the problem isn't just that we die, the problem is we're reborn. And instead of the Californian idea that reincarnation's groovy, man, groovy, as they used to say in the 60s, reincarnation, you go round and round and round, maybe Hindus say 35,000 times. And the only solution is freedom from this world, from the wheel. So in the East, freedom is not freedom to be an individual. It's freedom from individuality. And you can see that's a very radical view. So Buddha, when he was enlightened in Bodh Gaya, he didn't say, I am liberated. He said, it is liberated. He'd reached the not self. He called his own son Rahula, which means fetter or ball and chain. In other words, his family relationships were something holding him back from the renunciation of the world. And nirvana, which many people quote, actually means the great deathless lake of extinction. So Buddhism is the most gigantic no ever delivered to human aspirations. And I think it's a very poor answer to evil, although it has a very realistic view of evil from which we need to be delivered. When we come to the secularist views, it's very different. We're living in a meaningless universe because everything finally comes from chance. So there's no meaning to be discovered in the universe. If we want meaning, we've got to create it ourselves. And Bertrand Russell gave the picture of Atlas carrying his own universe on his own shoulders. Now, the secularists do fight evil heroically. Take, say, Albert Camus and his great picture of fighting evil in The Plague. And the plague is the metaphor for evil. Dr. Rieu is heroic in fighting evil. He's outraged by the plague. But, and these are Camus' words, at the end of the day, he faces never-ending defeat. Because evil is in the very existence of the universe with its absurdity, so we can never, ever hope to overcome it. And Camus' other famous picture with the myth of Sisyphus. The poor man condemned to roll a stone up the hill, rolls down again. Roll it up, rolls down again. Up again, down again. In other words, never-ending defeat. So we defy the universe, but there's a forlorn hopelessness about it. His compatriot, Jean-Paul Sartre, once remarked, atheism is a cruel long-term business. I've been through it to the end. It's always carrying atheism out to the logical end that creates the problem. I often look at the biblical view, the Jewish and Christian view, in terms of a response to what's called the trilemma. We all know what a dilemma is, a challenge with two horns, but a trilemma has three. And from Epictetus, who wrote before Jesus, right down to David Hume and modern atheists like J.L. Mackie, the trilemma has always been this: how can Jews and Christians believe that evil is very evil, God is all good, and God is all powerful? Now, the obvious answer, the obvious way out would be to relax one of those, and that's what Rabbi Kushner does. God is not, in fact, all powerful. But the Bible doesn't do that, and Christians don't do that. We hold all three. Evil is truly evil. God is all good, and God is all powerful. But the Bible gives each of them a twist that turns it from a challenge into a profound reassurance. Take the first one. Is evil evil? The Bible says evil is terribly evil, and God sees it as evil too. But it should have been otherwise. It wasn't supposed to be this way. In other words, for atheists, existence is the error, as Schopenhauer, as Samuel Beckett said, and you have no hope of overcoming it. Evil is natural to the world as we know it. In the biblical view for Jews and Christians, evil is unnatural. It's alien. It's a party pooper. It's a gate crasher. So when Jesus, read John 11, the Gospel of John, when Jesus is at the tomb of his friend Lazarus, who died prematurely, it says, the famous verse in the Bible, it's the shortest verse, Jesus wept. More importantly, it says 3 times, Jesus was furious. He and his Father had made the world good, but it had been marred by sin, by human evil. So evil is evil, but it should have been otherwise. And when we're shocked by bad news, or outraged by injustice, or crying and grieving because of sorrow, we are actually seeing the world the way that God himself sees it. It should have been otherwise. And that's the first and one of the basic answers of a Christian view of evil. The second part of the trilemma is God all good? And the Bible says, yes, all good. You can't have a shadow in some part of God's character, otherwise no one could ever trust him. You'd never really know what was good and what wasn't good. What the Bible says in the Old Testament and the New Testament, God cares, God comes, God acts. For me, in the Old Testament, the supreme passage is the story, the poem of the suffering servant, who comes to do God's work on behalf of us humans, who is tortured and hideously disfigured and killed on our behalf. I was talking this weekend to the family of a Jewish man who heard Isaiah 53 read, and he was angry. He said to the Christians, "You shouldn't read me from your New Testament." And they said, "No, it's your Old Testament. It's Isaiah." And he came to realize that, of course, is who Christians believe that Jesus is. You may know the story of Dostoevsky. He went through a hellfire of doubt, as he described it. But what was the turning point for him, trusting God and putting his faith in God? He saw a picture in Switzerland of the descent of Jesus from the cross, obviously after his crucifixion. He looked at it for 4 hours, and at the end of it he said this, "I do not know the answer to the meaning of evil, but I do know love." And that's what Christians believe, that when we see God in Jesus on the cross for us and for humanity, no one can go so low that our Lord has not gone lower, and we can trust him and know him that he is good. The third challenge of the trilemma is God all-powerful? Why are things happening? Cancer in my wife's family, the Haitian earthquake, Auschwitz, you name it. How can you trust God if we don't know what he's really doing? Is he really all-powerful? The best answer to this, and of course that's a very deep question, the best answer to this was given by Basil Mitchell, who was actually one of my tutors at Oxford. And he put it in terms of resisting in World War II in France. Imagine I come to you in a bar one night and they say, I gather you want to join the resistance. I am the local resistance leader. We'll talk for 2 hours tonight. If you put your trust in me and join the resistance, we will never talk live. It's too dangerous. Sometimes you'll know exactly what I'm doing. It's obvious. Sometimes you won't. I might be in Gestapo uniform, arresting one of our own side, and you won't know that I'm in disguise, releasing him out of sight, because he was about to be arrested by the real Gestapo. But at the end of the war, when the codes are broken and all the secrets are explained, then we'll know why everything happened. In other words, you need to know why we trust the resistance leader. And that is the Christian faith in the world of today, which C.S. Lewis described as enemy territory. The two big questions are these. Do we know that God is there, his existence? Do we know that God is good, his character? And for followers of Jesus, both of those are answered in Jesus. In Jesus. If God is the Father of Jesus Christ, I am sure God is there. If God is the Father of Jesus Christ, I am sure God is all good. So I don't know all the answers. I don't know why about Auschwitz. I don't know why about the Southeast Asian tsunami or whatever. But I know why I trust God, who knows why. So faith is not irrational. We can trust God in the dark simply because we're not in the dark about God.
Evil. For almost half a century, our culture has been embarrassed at words like wickedness, sin, judgment, punishment, and hell. Like a teenager embarrassed at being seen with her parents at a mall. Some of our deep thinkers say evil is only a temporary stage of evolution, a hangover from ancient barbarisms or provincialisms of race, class, and gender that we will just grow out of as we grow out of diapers. Others say evil is ignorance, thus curable by education. We are still waiting for the cure to take. Some say that evil against others is only the acting out of a lack of positive self-esteem. So Hitler was not enough in love with himself. But most of us, who are not nihilists, neo-Nazis, or pseudo-Islamic terrorists, believe that good is stronger than evil. And therefore that evil is less mighty and terrible than good. We tend to conclude from this, illogically, that we fear evil too much, not too little. We even admire FDR's famous nonsense that we have nothing to fear but fear itself. This strikes us as somehow psychologically healthy and even pious, and its denial unhealthy and even impious. But then we saw the spectacular evils of September 11th. In the chorus of voices that filled our media for the next 2 months, one voice was conspicuously silent from the babble. Psychobabble. What became of our prophets, the pop psychologists? Where had all the gurus gone? They went where dreams go when the alarm clock goes off, when our towers of Babel crash to the ground. We have seen the limitations of the power of positive thinking, Norman Vincent Peale's religious version of pop psychology. We used to find Peale appealing and St. Paul appalling for his negativism and judgmentalism and polemics. Now we're beginning to find Peale appalling and Paul appealing. And now we have been able to see 2/3 of the movie version of the book that everyone but our experts, the critics, chose as the greatest book of the 20th century. Of course, some truths are so obvious that only experts can deny them. The timing of this movie is a patently providential coincidence, for this movie is a story about evil. We need this story because we have been overgrown adolescents playing with paper airplanes and catching butterflies, and then suddenly our airplanes caught fire and our butterflies caught anthrax. We need this story because we need a wizard like Gandalf or Tolkien to remind us of forgotten wisdom. We need this story because when we have embraced 100 heresies as the orthodoxy of the future, the Lord of the Rings offers us the only possible radicalism left, tradition. Some say there are only 12 basic plots. Some say 7. Some say 3. I say 1. Jihad. Spiritual warfare between good and evil in some form. Every story worth telling has 3 stages. A situation is first set up, then upset, then reset, either happily or unhappily. First there is good, then there is evil, then there is warfare, with some resolution. Always some, never none, at least in this world, and never all. Theologians know this threefold scheme of the greatest story ever told as creation, fall, and redemption. Bilbo Baggins called it there and back again. Home, the road away from home, and the road back home again. For Frodo, it is the Shire, Mordor, and the Shire, or rather the Grey Havens. My purpose here is not to throw some philosophical abstractions onto Tolkien's wonderfully concrete text to muffle it like snow on a bell, but to let that text ring out, to do some bell ringing in the temple of Tolkien, to call your attention, like a tour guide, to some of his great words that remind us of forgotten wisdom about evil and how to fight it. I'm a philosopher, so my primary purpose is philosophical rather than literary, and that sets me at cross purposes with Tolkien, or perhaps better, angled purposes, for Tolkien told us in his foreword that his prime motive was literary, not philosophical. Quote, "The desire of a tale-teller to try his hand at a really long story that would hold the attention of readers, amuse them, delight them, and at times maybe excite them or even deeply move them." So I enter Tolkien's literary store as a thief, because I think his words also have great selling power in another store, philosophy. I believe that both literature and philosophy can be legitimate as ends or as means. When Tolkien created his story, he used his philosophy as a means, a fertilizer to grow the story. I now use his literature as means, as fertilizer to grow some philosophy. The philosophy is 10 forgotten points of wisdom about evil. First, that we are at war, not at peace. That our enemy, evil, is real. Second, that evil is very big. In fact, immortal. Third, that knowing the difference between good and evil is very easy and clear. Fourth, that knowledge is not always a good. Fifth, that what defeats evil is evil itself. Sixth, that evil works for good. And finally, that 4 of the most powerful weapons against evil are sacrifice, humility, friendship, and words. First, evil is real. Think of the first time you saw those spectacular images on your TV screen, September 11th. Now think not of the images, but of the feelings. Not the change outside you, but the change inside you. It was a very sharp and clear change because it was so sudden. It was the change from a peacetime consciousness to a wartime consciousness. It was a little like the change from sleeping consciousness to waking consciousness, which your alarm clock triggers in you every morning. The world that you woke up to was not brought into being by your act of waking up. It had always been there. But you were not always there. If you were dreaming that you were a soldier, you did not cease to be a soldier and begin to be a professor when you woke. You were a professor even while you were dreaming that you were a soldier. Now imagine that instead of a professor dreaming that you were a soldier, you were a soldier dreaming that you were a professor. And suppose the dream went on during the day rather than the night, and then an alarm rang. For many of us, that alarm was September 11th. For others, it was a phone call early in the morning about a family emergency or a death. For others, it was the Bible. But we who believe the Bible constantly fall asleep during battle and dream that we are not at war, but at peace, that we are in Upper Eden, not Middle Earth, and that there is no snake. There are 2 philosophies of life. One says, "Woe unto him who cries, peace, peace, when there is no peace." The other says, woe unto him who cries, snake, snake, when there is no snake. Which one is the dream, and which is the reality? Before September 11th, most of us saw America as the hobbits saw the Shire. Quote, a district of well-ordered business, and there in that pleasant corner of the world they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less the world outside where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the guardians, and of the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were, in fact, sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. Who are our guardians? Not the CIA or the FBI. We are sheltered not by guardian agents, but by guardian angels. And it is good to know just a little about them. Not too much and not nothing, but precisely those glimpses that have in fact been given to us. As Mary says, dear me, we tooks and brandybucks, we can't live long on the heights. No, said Pippin, I can't, not yet at any rate, but at least we can now see them and honor them. It is best to love first what you are fitted to love, I suppose. You must start somewhere and have some roots, and the soil of the Shire is deep. Still, there are things deeper and higher, and not a gaffer could tend his garden in what he calls peace but for them, whether he knows about them or not. I am glad I know about them a little. And so are we.
This is the second great book that has rushed onto the world in the last 4 or 5 years. It's Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great. Because this God that Jesus speaks of, this God that Jesus claims to be, lets unspeakable horrors exist. We know about the girl recently in California for 18 years, was kept in a shed and birthed 2 children who grew up in a shed. I can go on and on. It takes no creativity to list all the horrors that we're consistently exposed to in the media today. And God is sovereign over that? You've got to be kidding me. If that God is God, then he's my devil, as been famously said.
Right.
And so Hitchens is there to say not only is he immoral, he is irresponsible and asleep.
Yes. I would respond to this by saying we need to draw some distinctions here concerning what philosophers have called the problem of evil or the problem of pain and suffering. I think there's a distinction, Todd, between this problem as an intellectual problem and this problem as an emotional problem. And I think emotionally there's certainly no doubt that the evil and pain and suffering in the world occasion great doubts that God exists. But I have to say that when I consider the problem philosophically as a purely intellectual problem, I think it's extraordinarily difficult for the atheist to mount a convincing argument that the evil and suffering in the world renders God's existence either impossible or improbable.
Okay. Lay that on us.
There are different versions of the intellectual problem of evil. One is the logical version, and basically what it says is that God and evil are logically incompatible with each other. They're like the immovable object and the irresistible force. They can't both exist. If one exists, the other doesn't exist. It can't exist. And since evil obviously exists, it follows that God cannot exist. Now, the problem with this argument is that there's no contradiction between saying God is all-powerful and all-loving and evil exists. There's no explicit contradiction there. So if the atheist is saying these are implicitly contradictory, he must be making some hidden assumptions that would bring out this contradiction and make it explicit. So the question is, well, what are those hidden assumptions that the atheist is making? And it seems to me that there are two. He's assuming that if God is all-powerful, then he can create any world that he wants. And secondly, he's assuming that if God is all good, that he would prefer to create a world without evil or without suffering. And both of these hidden assumptions need to be necessarily true in order to show a contradiction between God's existence and the evil in the world. And the problem is that neither of those assumptions appears to be necessarily true. For example, does God's being all-powerful mean that he can create just any world that he wants? Well, not if he chooses to give creatures free will. It is logically impossible to make someone do something freely. That is as logically impossible as making an unmarried bachelor or square circle. So there may well be worlds that are impossible for God to create because in them the creatures would freely perpetrate evil and harm upon each other. And if God wants a world to have significant moral agents in them who achieve moral goodness, he may have to put up with a good deal of moral evil as well. So that first assumption is just not necessarily true. And similarly, the second assumption, if God is...
Let me interject with that. So what you're basically saying is that because God's going to create a perfect and good creation, that perfect and good creation must have in it creatures that have the ability to do things that are good, which include love, and in order to be able to love, you got to have the ability to choose to not love.
That's exactly right. In order for there to be moral goodness in a world, you've got to have more than robots or puppets. You've got to have free agents. And once you do that, then things can get out of control in the sense that these agents can perpetrate evil and harm upon one another, which God could prevent only by removing their freedom of the will, in which case he removes moral goodness as well.
Which makes it a moral world, which
right.
is not a perfect world.
Right. It would be a world without any sort of moral goodness. So it's simply not true that God's being all-powerful means that he can just create any old world that he desires, as the atheist seems to assume. And the second assumption I don't think is necessarily true either. That is that if God is all good, then he prefers a world without evil and suffering. We all know cases in which we permit evil and suffering to occur for some greater good that can be brought about. C.S. Lewis once remarked, I think very aptly, what do people mean, I'm not afraid of God because I know that he is good? Have they never even been to the dentist? And of course, Lewis wrote that before Novocaine was used when they drilled on your teeth. We know cases where we allow pain and suffering to occur for some sort of greater good. Every parent, I think, knows that fact. So that second assumption just isn't true either. And therefore, the atheist has failed to show any sort of logical inconsistency between God and the existence of evil. In fact, we can actually show that these are consistent by adding a third proposition, which I think is on the screen. Namely, God could not have created a world which had as much good as the actual world, but with less evil, and God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil that exists. As long as that's even possible, it proves that God and evil are logically consistent. And therefore, I'm very happy to be able to tell folks this morning that this logical version of the problem of evil is widely, almost unanimously regarded today as resolved. Even by atheist philosophers, they don't press this problem anymore because they've recognized that it's just impossible for the atheist to prove it's impossible for God and evil to coexist, and it's very easy for the theist to offer an explanation or an account of how they might be coexistent.
In fact, when I was with you in downtown Dallas, when you discussed this with Christopher Hitchens, and while Hitchens was winsome and hilarious and gave lots of anecdotal stories, at the end of the day, he could not argue against the existence of God and even acknowledged what about the Christian solution to evil.
Yes, that was one thing that was surprising about Hitchens, wasn't it? Was that he had the honesty to admit that, yes, at the end of the day, this argument really doesn't go through. What it has, again, is simply emotional force.
Yes.
But you see, as a philosopher, I'm called upon not to say how I feel about something, but what I think about it. And when you think about it...
That's what men get in trouble with their wives, right
well,
there.
You're granted, but
you realize
we're not
that.
dealing
Can I
with
tell my
wives.
wife I'm a philosopher? I'm not supposed to feel. Let me explain to you what you don't understand. I've tried that. That doesn't work well.
My wife has learned to argue logically with me.
Oh, goodness. All right, so, Hitchens, I think he said that, look, the Christian argument for evil is cogent, it's coherent, if it was true. And then I think, I love the way you summarized that debate. It wasn't a debate because he didn't come prepared. Do you remember what you said to him at the end of that?
Well, I think I do. What do you remember?
I think what you did is you basically said, Christopher, and I think you were going to be together with him shortly after that.
Right, we had a debate scheduled at Biola University just 2 weeks after this panel discussion in Dallas.
Right, and so you said to him...
I said, after summarizing the arguments and his failure to refute them, he was seated to my left, and I turned to him and I said, So I hope, Mr. Hitchens, that when we meet in 2 weeks at Biola University, you have done substantially more study on these arguments so that you can discuss them in a more significant way.
Yeah, you basically undressed him. You basically said, you just acknowledge that everything I've said is true. You're not, what you have is no really philosophical or intellectual support, and I couldn't even debate you.
And the funny thing is, he didn't do that homework.
No, of course
he showed up unprepared at Biola as well.
Because what Bill Maher does, what Christopher has done is, you're right, they appeal to the emotion.
Yeah.
They use humor to distract.
Ridicule is one of their most important weapons. Satire and ridicule. And that will persuade people in a way that often argument will not.
Right.
Because people, unfortunately, so often don't think logically. They don't know how to think logically. That's why I love that song that Sasha sung about what if you go deeper than your simple-minded friends and begin to poke holes in the logic. Yeah. You suddenly discover that all of this atheist rhetoric is just that. It's mere rhetoric and emotional appeals.
Yeah. Which, boy, it sure helps me sleep well until I'm honest. I mean, it allows me in the public square, but laying in bed at night, I think the simple-mindedness pierces our hearts, and that's God reaching out, drawing you back, saying, hey, consider me, away from the humor and away from the ridicule.
Yes, my question is for Dr. Zacharias. How do you respond to those in this country who run our elite schools, who write our textbooks, the evil is not within us, but outside of us, like in a person who has a handgun or social economic created conditions, that it is otherwise?
Well, since that's direct, do you want to go ahead?
You know, I'll be happy to respond to it, but these are the kinds of specialties that this gentleman really writes about. I think you want me to go first, but I'd like you to respond on this too. Give the question a bit of a pointed edge here. I think I'm hearing what you're saying, but how do you respond to a culture that is saying the evil is outside of us and not inside us?
Yes. It seems my vague or little perspective of the universities, those who write all the textbooks that end up in our elementary education schools do not hold a Judeo-Christian worldview anymore, and that our evil is, like President Obama said, it's in the streets. It's people who are poor because of people oppressing them, not so much something that comes from within a person.
You know, then we should not be imprisoning people like Madoff and the head of Enron. We should be imprisoning their neighbors because of his environment that these people did such things. These things have partial truths in them, and I said it in a bit of a flip off the cuff manner, and what they're really trying to say is that we are oftentimes the product of our environment. And I won't name the countries, but my wife and I were visiting there where there's a constant war going on in the border there, and we were pointed to a man who took his 12-year-old son up to the hill every day. Every day. He would take his boy right from the time he was a little boy, take him up to the top of the hill and point to the country across the line there, and he said, your whole goal in life should be to kill as many of those people in that country as you possibly can. That is your purpose in life and why you are here. And you take a little boy by the hand, and day after day you pummel that kind of stuff into him. And then he wraps bombs around himself and blows himself up one day. You can see what they did with a young mind like that they ultimately radicalized and influenced and controlled. And the tragedy is that this is a deadly half-truth, but it is a half-truth all right. It is your environment and your upbringing has an awful lot to do with this. And so you watch the movies in our time. Look at the impact pornography has taken on this culture. I'm dealing with it with young men all the time as I travel. And it is a horrific thing to be trapped by, because what it actually does is destroy personhood in the process and makes you pursue a feeling rather than even a person, because no one person can ultimately bring you the happiness. It's a feeling that you're in search of, and it'll never be parked in that feeling all the time. So the environment that is conditioning our minds is taking a heavy toll. But what is conditioning the environment? Are these minds also cumulatively just the product of all kinds of ideas? Does nobody ultimately have to take any responsibility? There was a great case in India recently, and in that case the head of a large IT company, one of the largest, which is actually called Satyam, which actually in that language means truth. But they were fudging on their books, they were cheating in billions of dollars. And finally he was caught, and he's in jail now. And here's what he said: "My problem is this. I was riding this tiger of deceit for so long, I was afraid to get off lest it eat me up." It was not his environment. It was what he had chosen to do. So ultimately we have to have responsibility individually, not just blame the society on it. Otherwise, next thing you do, you're pushing your neighbor off a cliff because your mother didn't let you push your oats off your tray when you were a little boy, or something like that. This kind of ad infinitum reasoning, if you take away responsibility, you actually take away the possibility of any court of law dealing with any act in any nature if it is always someone else's fault. You have to ultimately have evil explained, and it is on the outside because it is on the inside first. It did not come on the inside from the outside. All that is within you is evil, and all the list that God gives to us comes from the heart of man. That's what really defiles. Any thoughts on that, Oz?
What you're describing is the fruits of the 18th century Enlightenment, which doesn't believe in evil, doesn't believe in sin or responsibility, so looks to things like more psychology, better politics, higher education, and this will solve the problem. And clearly 20th century evil has blown a huge hole in that. Now when you meet people who still believe in it, I think this is the way to approach them. They have never met real evil. Let me give you an example. The great poet W.H. Auden came to faith through meeting evil. He was a socialist, an atheist, and a left-wing radical who'd fought on the Republican side in Spain in the Civil War, came to America to escape Nazism. But one evening, watching a documentary in New York, saw Hitler's troops entering Poland, bayoneting women and children. And most of the German audience were on the side of the Nazi stormtroopers and cried out in the darkness, kill them, egging them on. And Auden said, in 2 minutes, my whole worldview was turned around. On the one hand, I knew we were evil. I was looking at something that no psychology, no education, and no politics could ever change. This is radical evil. But then he said, I realized as a European intellectual, I'd spent all my life removing the absolutes. Everything's relative. But I wanted to say that Hitler was absolutely evil. So he said, I left the cinema a seeker after an unconditional absolute, and I met Christ. In other words, many of these people have a very shallow view of human life, and also very shallow political policies too. And it always runs aground on the rock of reality and real evil.
That raises problems. Is this state of affairs in accordance with God's will or not? If it is, he is a strange God, you will say, and if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? But anyone who has been in authority knows how a thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not in another. It may be quite sensible for a mother to say to the children, I'm not going to go and make you tidy the schoolroom every night. You've got to learn to keep it tidy on your own. Then she goes up one night and finds the teddy bear and the ink and the French grammar all lying in the grate. That is against her will. She would prefer the children to be tidy. But on the other hand, it is her will which has left the children free to be untidy. The same thing arises in any regiment or trade union or school. You make a thing voluntary, and then half the people do not do it. That is not what you willed, but your will has made it possible. It is probably the same in the universe. God created things which had free will. That means creatures which can go either wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong. I cannot. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. A world of automata, of creatures that worked like machines, would hardly be worth creating. The happiness which God designs for his higher creatures is the happiness of being freely, voluntarily united to him and to each other, in an ecstasy of love and delight compared with which the most rapturous love between a man and a woman on this earth is mere milk and water. And for that they must be free. Of course, God knew what would happen if they used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, he thought it worth the risk. Perhaps we feel inclined to disagree with him. But there is a difficulty about disagreeing with God. He is the source from which all your reasoning power comes. You could not be right and he wrong any more than a stream can rise higher than its own source. When you are arguing against him, you are arguing against the very power that makes you able to argue at all. It is like cutting off the branch you are sitting on. If God thinks this state of war in the universe a price worth paying for free will, that is, for making a live world in which creatures can do real good or harm and something of real importance can happen, instead of a toy world which only moves when he pulls the strings, then we may take it is worth paying. When we have understood about free will, we shall see how silly it is to ask, as somebody once asked me, why did God make a creature of such rotten stuff that it went wrong? The better stuff a creature is made of, the cleverer and stronger and freer it is, then the better it will be if it goes right. But also the worse it will be if it goes